media company, Vice, wants Vice to be the next CNN, the next ESPN, and the next MTV digitally. You've also said you want to be the Time Warner of the street.
We already are the Time Warner of the street.
Vice magazine, which started in Montreal in 1994, it's become a global empire. You got Vice.com, international network of digital channels, TV production studio, a record label, an in-house creative services agency. Describe the Vice brand. What is it?
Vice is the voice of a generation. The world's first truly global, multi-platform youth media company. Vice delivers hours of original video content every day, covering the news, culture, and entertainment that define the world we live in.
Everyone was investing platform, money into platform, but no one was saying, well, what are we going to fill that pipe with?
Vice is a network of channels, each geared to the passions of young people today. Vice.com is the global portal to all of these exciting channels.
Are you a masochist?
Noisy is the most exciting, original, and inspiring music channel on the web.
I'm a do me, and I'm a be me.
Motherboard documents the present and future of science and technology. Thump is a total immersion into electronic dance music.
The party goes on.
The Creators Project is a celebration of art and creativity.
This is for the globe.
An ID brings together the worlds of the runway and the street. Munchies is defining a new era in food programming.
Oh, so good.
Vice Sports is a fresh take on the culture of sports.
My legacy will always live on.
And Vice News, the fastest growing news channel on the web, is leading a revolution in news reporting for and by young people.
You know, this is what it is here. It's chaos.
Since launching 1 year ago, Vice News has quickly become a powerful new voice and trusted source.
My guest tonight is a journalist for ViceNews.com who witnessed it firsthand.
With the pioneering Vice on HBO series winning an Emmy, Vice and HBO are dramatically expanding their relationship.
It's like the most heartbreaking thing I've ever experienced.
In addition to tripling the amount of episodes and specials we're producing each year, we'll be launching a half-hour daily newscast that will dramatically expand our storytelling.
You're going to see a lot of those stories in a way that you're not going to see anywhere else.
Through deep support from partnerships with YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and now Snapchat, Vice is creating the best original content for every screen and platform, reaching hundreds of millions of young people every month with unprecedented levels of engagement.
Young people today have been marketed to since they were newborns. They've developed the most sophisticated bullshit detectors of all time. And the only way to circumvent that bullshit detector is to not bullshit. The people who shoot it have to be young. The people who cut it have to be young. The hosts have to be young. So if something is created in a boardroom, it will not work.
Vice and its growing network of channels is defining the future of news and entertainment for young people everywhere.
There's a changing of the guard every generation in media, and we are the changing of the guard for Gen Y.
Well, that was certainly filled with Shane Smith's vision of the world. I'm Lucas Shaw. I'm a reporter with Bloomberg. This is Danny from Vice, who's the man that you came to see. They asked me earlier about questions. The way I prefer to handle these is if you've got a question at any point during the session, just raise your hand and we'll answer it then. Rather than save it till the end, you know, there may be something that comes up during that that intrigues you and you want to ask, and it may give us ideas for things we want to talk about. And where I want to start, as the video showed, you know, Vice started, I think the name wasn't even Vice when it first started.
It's Voice of Montreal.
Yeah. It was a countercultural magazine or alternative, however you want to.
It was mostly punk rock
Yeah.
with a little bit of hip hop thrown in. It was the early 90s.
And the video business started to pick up, what, in the mid-2000s?
It was 2005, actually. Our chief creative officer, Eddie Moretti, was sitting in the Vice office in New York and got a phone call And this guy said, "Hi, I'm Spike Jones. I'm a big fan of you guys. Wouldn't it be great if you turned your articles into web videos?" And they talked for 2 hours and came up with Vice's web video platform. So,
And by that point, Spike Jones had already made several movies.
several movies,
Mitch,
adaptation.
yeah.
I think he was actually working on Wild Things at that point.
And so Danny joined Vice in 2012, September of 2012, I think.
That's when it was publicly announced.
Publicly announced. He came over from William Morris Endeavor, which is one of the two biggest kind of talent agencies in the entertainment business, which signaled to many that Vice was taking kind of video and all things entertainment far more seriously, because on that video you saw it listed all these sub-brands, Vice News, Munchies, Thump, Noisy. Very few of them even existed at that point. What was your mandate when you first came in, and how has that shifted? Because I feel like that will help show the way in which Vice has really grown.
The mandate when I first showed up was help us grow our original content business. Which was a very broad thing at that point. And at that point, if you actually looked at the websites, if you looked at what Vice's video business was at that point, I think at the time that I went over, Vice had a few feature-length documentaries under their belt that had done the festival circuit. They were doing a decent amount of original content for Vice.com, which, even at that point, Vice.com had only launched about a year earlier. Before that, it was VBS.TV. And if anything, it was, the majority of the content on Vice.com, I would say, was actually very similar to a slightly nascent form of what you now see on our HBO show. It was these kind of long-form documentaries. A lot of them were initially 15 minutes long or so, that involved Vice employees, a lot of the different reporters or Shane, going off to crazy places around the world and seeing, what was happening there firsthand. And at the time that I came over, we had a lot of big things we talked about, but it was, hey, let's actually go and make this into a TV show. That was the point when we had just started developing and piloting the HBO show. It was, hey, let's figure out other ways to get into television. Let's take these shows that we're doing online and figure out how to turn them into TV series. Let's figure out how to do more shows for online. Let's figure out how to go and make music videos for our Noisy channel. Let's go and figure out how to make more food content beyond the one food show we were doing at the time. And it was, let's go and make scripted feature films. And, all of those things have happened and then some. And since then, we've all started streamlining and refining what we're doing at the company more, because there's more stuff to do. So,
how many hours of video would you say Vice produces a day now?
A day? I'd have to extrapolate the statistic, but it's I don't know if anyone here knows the statistic. No, it's I think it's over 100. It's over 100 a month.
Over 100 hours a month.
Yeah.
So at least 3 hours a day.
Yeah, a couple hours a day.
And how much is most of that going straight on to your various websites? Where does that?
At the moment, yeah, the majority of it is going onto our websites, because in terms of our regular content flow, it's things appearing on the websites, it's content appearing on, exclusive content appearing on Snapchat. And then there's the HBO show, which is about half an hour a week.
Right. And you mentioned Snapchat. You guys have partnerships with kind of any number of different everybody wants to distribute video now. Some free, some not. There's Snapchat, there's Facebook, there's YouTube. Verizon has a new service internationally. You see all these different do you produce distinct videos for each of those places, or do you produce one thing and then format it a little bit differently for all the different?
It's a good question. And, what I would say is, we tend to think about the content first, and if there's a particular limitation, like, oh, you really can only get a video up to a certain length on a particular service, I guess we'll sit there and we'll say, well, this video has to be cut down to 8 minutes. But we're just so much more driven by particular stories that are interesting to us that we want to tell at any given moment, and we tend not to get too caught up in whatever the platform it's being created for or where it'll first premiere will be. And I think to some extent that has to do with the fact that when Vice first got into the video business, the very first thing they did was they started to make this web series that for VBS. It was the first one they were working on. It was a documentary series called Heavy Metal in Baghdad. And when they finished it, they looked at it and they said, you know what, this is actually a feature film. And they edited all of the different episodes together and ended up releasing it theatrically and premiering it at film festivals and doing the whole festival circuit and everything. And then they ended up at some point breaking it up and airing different pieces of it online. But there was, from the get-go, there was never this kind of distinction of, oh, we're making something for the web, so it has to be webisodes, and that's how it's going to live, and we have to confine ourselves to this webisode format. And I think the really telling thing in terms of the company putting its money where its mouth was when HBO offered Vice a TV show and said, what do you want the show to be, and what is the format, and what are the episodes, it was a slightly more polished version of the videos we were already making for the web. Oftentimes the exact same length, same hosts.
How do those have an average?
Yeah, average of like 14, 15 minutes usually. I think at the season finale of the first season was the first longer episode we had really done, but by that point we had already been doing web documentaries that were longer formats, 45 minutes longer, whatnot. So we've just never been caught up in what the platform where we're putting something is, and I think part of it at the same time is, at the point that YouTube came around and that suddenly became a big thing and people were throwing a bunch of money at YouTube channels, and YouTube offered Vice offered Vice 3 channels when it first started up. It had one for Vice.com, one for the Creators Project, and one for Noisy. YouTube said, well, we have these best practices that make for the most watchable content on YouTube, and videos should skew funny, they should be snackable, they should be around 4 minutes in length, and that's what really plays well here. And they should have some sort of clickbait to them, whatever that meant. And Vice went and made a bunch of videos that fit that format and put them on Vice's YouTube channel, and nobody watched them. And it just wasn't doing that well. And then Vice started taking all of these longer form documentaries that they had made for VBS and just started posting them on the YouTube channel. And suddenly the YouTube channel skyrocketed and became basically the most popular channel on YouTube in terms of user engagement and subscription-based growth and all of that. And it was just proof once again that, there are no rules with this stuff, and you can't just say, hey, we understand what an audience's consumption habits are for this particular platform, and you got to make things that conform to the platform, because at the end of the day, people just want a good story. They want the best content they can watch, and they're going to go wherever they need to go in order to watch it.
Yeah. And is news your most popular YouTube channel?
Vice.com is the most popular YouTube channel, and to some extent it aggregates a little bit of content from everything. But news is, in terms of our channels that only do one thing, the most popular one.
It's the strongest sub brand.
Yeah, and it's the strongest sub brand, and it's the one I'd say that has grown the quickest.
And is that just because that's where the interest has been, and you've put a lot of the resources first, or?
I think there's a lot of, I think there was a lot of passion within the company, and a lot of interest to get into this stuff because, the people that run Vice and all of the young people that work there, they're people that care about what's going on in the world, and they're people with a real intellectual interest in what's going on out there. And there was just no place at the time that was really showing a raw, hyper intellectual look at what was actually happening out there in the world. And what we realized, especially as I think we were getting deeper into the HBO show, is there were all of these incredible journalists out there that just didn't have a platform anymore to do the kinds of deep investigative journalism that there actually was an appetite for out there. So we basically just doubled down on the kinds of documentaries we were already doing for Vice.com and said, we're just going to go deeper. We're going to grab the best investigative journalists out there that aren't at the right home, and we're going to try and collect as many of them as possible into one place and let them go and do their thing.
Yeah. And almost all the footage that or the shows that you make for HBO are news centric.
Yeah, I'd say so. They're I wouldn't call it lifestyle programming.
But you're kind of the next wave for Vice seems to be. You're going to have to start or you're starting to produce maybe the Daily Show for HBO.
Yeah, which that'll be even more news focused, and then that kind of I think is going to be counterbalanced by a bunch of the content that we're making at the moment that we actually previewed at our upfront a couple months back, which is I would call documentary, high-end documentary-based lifestyle programming. So we're doing some pretty provocative, incredible series with Ellen Page, she's doing a show called Gaycation, which is all about gay subcultures around the world. It still ultimately has a very serious news angle to it because she's investigating some pretty serious provocative issues tied into all of these things. We're doing a show with Michael K. Williams, who played Omar on The Wire, called Black Market. And that's all about illegal economies around the world. And, we originally met him about it because we said, this is a cool guy who seems to be associated with a lot of interesting stuff. And we thought there was something interesting because he was on a show about an illegal subculture. And when we met him, what we realized is the first thing he said to us was, he was the chief spokesman for the ACLU's division against wrongful incarceration. And this was actually what we were trying to explore in the show was actually a very personal passion point for him. And what he really wanted to explore was, why do people do illegal stuff? Is it because they're, terrible people, or is it because there's actually conditions in the world that force them into this? And there's much more, there's a much wider spectrum of why people are forced into illegal behavior. So,
did you go into those shows knowing that you wanted to have kind of a celebrity or a host of sorts to help elevate them? Or?
We wanted, with most of our content, we tend to try and find somebody that has a very humanistic take on the material and has a very personal take on the material, but also is, very relatable in a way where their passion for whatever it is we're investigating comes across and the audience can identify with that and then better understand the world that they're investigating. And I named two that happen to be celebrities because they came to my head. But, for example, we're also doing a show called Fashion Week International that's being hosted by a girl named Haley Gates, who was, before she went to go do that show, was I think she was the head of ad sales for the Paris Review, and she was a friend of a friend, and somebody recommended her for this thing. And, she's now doing this really provocative show that looks at the fashion business in third world countries, and not a celebrity at all, but she's got an incredible amount of empathy. She's a fascinating character, and when she goes and investigates these things, you understand as an audience, as a viewer, what she is feeling experiencing this stuff, and it helps you get a better sense of the world, feel more connected to it.
And you've talked about wanting to make shows for any platform, but is the idea that all these shows will eventually live first on TV and then?
I think a lot of the higher end stuff that we're doing now, especially post these bigger HBO deals and the big deals that we've done with A&E, last year, that stuff will be intended to live on a television window first, and then we'll also figure out ways to get it into other places. So, once again, I think the idea is we want to be on every platform. We want to be on TV. We want to really embrace television. We also want to continue to really embrace digital. We want to embrace OTT. We want to embrace holograms.
And when we were talking right before this, well, first of all, off that, what's the hologram you haven't seen that you want to see?
That's a really good question. Like to see a hologram of Walter Carlos meeting Wendy Carlos, having a conversation with each other. Esoteric question, you get an esoteric answer.
When we were talking outside, you said,
By the way, I wouldn't mind Jim Morrison singing a duet with Janis Joplin.
That would be pretty good.
That'd be good.
Yeah.
Hendrix on guitar.
Yeah. You have to pick a drummer.
Keith Moon.
Okay. You can. That
This
can
sounds
be
like a horrible shit show. They would never get to playing any songs.
When you join Vice, I'm just gonna keep going.
Pretend that never happened.
When you joined Vice, it would have been described. Then, I mean, people were just realizing that it was going to be a video company, even though they'd been making it for a while. It was definitely a digital first company. Mm-hmm. What is it now? Is TV the biggest part of your business? Is online? How do those two parts feed into one another?
It's funny. Shane actually did say it really well, since you made the reference to Shane's pontifications on media theory in that video. He said it really well when he said everybody gets caught up in platform, and people tend to not talk enough about the stuff you're making for the platforms. And the truth of the matter is, once again, we make all of this stuff, and half the time we're making stuff, we don't know if we're going to stick it on TV or if we're going to stick it on the web. And we just sit there and we go, you know what? We're going to make the best possible stuff we're going to make. A lot of the producers and shooters that actually go and work on this stuff are the same people, whether the people that go and will shoot an episode of Munchies for our food channel are oftentimes the same people that are going and shooting an episode of our HBO show, and they'll piggyback one thing on the other. And I think we focus more on just making the stuff than exactly where it'll live. And if you were to do some sort of internal audit of how much time is getting spent on something that's going to eventually be allocated to one thing to another, I mean, you almost couldn't, because we haven't even decided where all of this content's going to live yet.
Yeah. Other than HBO,
other than HBO, which has a very specific team.
Well, and other than HBO, your first TV channel is supposed to be here in Canada. You have a studio that you're building in Toronto, or that you've built.
Yeah.
What should people expect out of that? And when you're producing, I mean, you say you just focus on producing good shows. Is the thought that what you produce for the channel that you guys have with Rogers and what that becomes can also live on a U.S. channel that you're supposed to get at some point in the next year?
Well, I think in terms of your question about what content would be on the channel, excuse me, that some of the shows that I made reference to that are documentary series with a slightly more lifestyle focus, but that are still about hard-hitting issues happening around the world. A lot of the content that we previewed at our upfront, you'll see a lot of stuff like that when the channel's up and running. And in terms of where that content will live in other places, I think we're figuring it out, and the content will live in the best possible place that it should live. Yeah. It'll get the right audience.
And one of the things that you're working on that will kind of add to that is scripted series. What does a Vice scripted show look like?
It's a really good question, because I think we ask ourselves this one very specific question all the time, which most people probably don't need to ask, which is why narrative, and why tell a scripted version of a story when you obviously can tell an incredibly emotional, heart-wrenching, authentic story in documentary form. And it's a question that we don't have the answer to. Eddie Moretti and I get into constant debates about this, and people will come to us and they'll say, yeah, we want to do this documentary, and we think you should turn this documentary into a feature film when it's done. It would be great for that. And we go, why? And then they say, oh, you don't think it's a good idea? And we say, no, but why narrative? And it's not because we're naysaying it. It's because we're constantly asking ourselves the question of why get into scripted, and is there a way in which scripted content can connect with people on an emotional level that documentary content can't? Is that totally not true? We're always thinking of examples that say the one, and then we turn around and find an example that says the other. One of my favorite recent examples in favor of documentary is if you look at a movie like All Good Things versus The Jinx. I saw All Good Things when it was in the theater. I thought it was fine. No offense to the director, but I think the director went on and made an incredible version of that story with The Jinx, which was done in a documentary form. Same story, same filmmaker, but the documentary version was so much more emotionally affecting than the scripted version, and then actors trying to make you live through experiencing that thing in the place and time. And it was so much more harrowing to hear the actual killer talk about the events around these murders, as opposed to watching an actor play it and act it out and watching a dramatization of a murder. But then on the other side of it, you look at a movie like Black Mass and the documentary that came out around the Whitey Bulger story. And I saw the documentary. I thought the documentary was really well done. I think Joe Barlinger is a fantastic director, but I thought Black Mass was much more emotionally affecting as a piece of content. And I don't know the answer to this question, but for us, like most of the content that we do, it's kind of a gut instinct thing, and we'll sit there and we'll suddenly think of a project and a story that we want to tell in a narrative form. And, that could be an edgier version of Argo and something that's very historically focused about some crazy thing that happened, where we just feel like, hey, if we do this as a narrative piece, it could be so much more visceral than if we were going to just go and do a documentary about it. Or I think about something like Fishing Without Nets, which is a really interesting example. It's the first scripted film that Vice ever did. It won Best Director at the Sundance Film Festival about 2 years back in the U.S. dramatic competition, which was interesting because it was a Somali language film that was starring actual Somali mercenaries. And And you have something interesting there where you can never make a documentary about those guys without putting them on an Interpol watch list. I need to drink some water. But you can go and do a narrative film that's based on their stories and inspired by their stories and give people an idea of the world where you're never going to have a documentary crew on a boat while they're going and committing an act of piracy. So,
is that an example? I mean, when you're thinking about what might work as a scripted series, that would be a good example of some of the topics you're kicking around, or would you veer into something, more contrived?
I don't think, I think with us, everything needs to have that level of authenticity and that level of inventiveness in terms of the story. I think anything we do needs to address whatever we're addressing topic-wise with a really fresh perspective, and it needs to tell the story in a way that nobody else is doing it. And we need to be telling stories that nobody else is telling. So I think, if anything, there needs to be some layer of touching on the greater human condition in anything we do, whether it's a really screwed up comedy that, points out crazy things going on in the world, or whether it's a really fierce drama. That's not to say I don't think other people have been able to pull stuff like that off. I think The Sopranos is ostensibly about a mafia family, but it's one of the great psychological profiles of what it's like to live in big box, modern, North American culture.
Yeah. Now, there's a kind of a prominent investor, this guy Peter Thiel, who also helped found PayPal. And I just remember from this book he wrote recently, one of the points that he makes is that there are companies who spend all this time talking about how different they are from everyone, which usually means that they're probably a lot like everybody else. They just want to try and draw this distinction. Then the companies that make something that's really revelatory try and downplay that so that they can they essentially sneak up on everyone and take over a market. Vice is a company where Shane in particular spends a lot of time talking about how different you guys are from everyone. How much of that, what is different about the videos that you make and your approach, and how much of that is legitimate and how much of it is kind of bluster?
That's a really good question. I think that we're different in that, at least at the moment, I do think we are doing more audacious stuff than most other people out there. I think at a time when, especially, let's use the news thing as an example, just because you brought it up before, and there's a lot of different examples we could pull from, but it's a good one. With the news example, we were reaching a time when you could look at the BBC and you could look at the BBC, CNN, a lot of the great news services, and they were cutting their international bureaus, they were cutting their investigative journalism, they were trying to push themselves more towards kind of topical lifestyle stuff, and we were pushing in the exact opposite direction. I think there are other places out there that were doing hard-hitting news. Al Jazeera, is a great example of it. I think they really push themselves in a great provocative way. I think the New York Times is doing really provocative stuff, some of the most provocative pieces in years that they've been doing. And if anything, I think they're a great example of an organization that's really doubled down on the audaciousness of the content they're doing in a really smart way. But I think we're different in that we were going against the broader trend of what was happening out there. And we were also trying to target this stuff at young people at a time when people were generally saying young people didn't really care about this stuff, and all they wanted to do was talk about themselves on social media and take selfies. And I think people at the time that Vice was really pushing this direction were really underestimating millennial culture. I think other people have now woken up to that and realized that it's actually a generation that's much more in tune with what's happening in the world and much more connected and empathetic. But we were definitely on the crest of that wave.
Well, I think that's a good place to end. Thank you all for coming. And now you get to go and eat and drink and do whatever you want with the rest of your night. Thanks, guys.